Hello, I'm Sara Nelson, Director of the Christic Institute, an interfaith law and public policy center in Washington, D.C. The Institute was founded by the team of people who successfully investigated and prosecuted the Karen Silkwood case against the Kerr-McGee Nuclear Corporation in 1979. We are presently prosecuting a major federal racketeering case against Richard Secord, Albert Hakim, Robert Owen, and 24 other men who participated with Oliver North in the Iran-Contra scandal. One of the least known aspects of the Iran-Contra scandal is the responsibility of Secord's enterprise in the smuggling of hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. The use of crack cocaine is reaching epidemic proportions in our communities, condemning many of our nation's youth to lives of violence and despair. Because of its widespread and devastating impact, this crisis has become the top priority of health professionals, educators, community activists, religious leaders, and mothers and fathers. We have the determination and the power to deal with this problem, but we cannot effectively respond to the crisis until we understand the real cause of it. This video explores the most important cause of the drug crisis, which has long been concealed: the alarming connection between drugs on our streets and U.S. covert operations abroad. Evidence from recent congressional investigations has confirmed the findings of the Christic Institute. U.S. government officials and private contractors of the Richard Secord enterprise have formed alliances with known drug traffickers in pursuit of foreign policy goals, most recently the support of the Nicaraguan Contras. Drugs are an important source of non-governmental secret funds to finance illegal covert operations. This secret money finances the kind of activities that you and I, as taxpayers, have refused to support: political assassination programs and the overthrow of other democratically elected governments. The use of drug traffickers as financiers and transporters of Contra arms has caused the vast increase of cocaine into the United States during the 1980s. All this has taken place during George Bush's war on drugs, while he was both the Vice President and the President of the United States. The Contra-cocaine relationship is not exceptional. It is only the most recent development in a long and deeply rooted history of enterprise collusion with drug traffickers around the world, in Thailand, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. It is no coincidence that wherever a covert war has been waged by the Covert Operations Division of the CIA, the supply of illegal drugs from that part of the world has increased dramatically. Heroin, opium, and cocaine traffickers have expanded their operations without fear of prosecution. All of this is justified in the name of national security. The information presented in this video has been uncovered by our investigation of the 1984 bombing of a press conference in La Penca, Nicaragua. The Institute filed its federal racketeering lawsuit in May 1986 on behalf of an ABC cameraman who was injured by the explosion. The lawsuit charges that those responsible for the bombing at La Penca, the Secord enterprise, have engaged in drug smuggling, money laundering, political assassinations, illegal weapons sales, and other criminal activities for many years. Currently on appeal, this historic lawsuit is expected to go to trial in 1991. As the Institute's investigation department continues to uncover facts about the criminal activities of our defendants, we will share this information with our network and the public. The flow of truthful information is crucial to the strength and well-being of a democracy. As democracy is breaking out in Eastern Europe, we are experiencing in the U.S. the growth of a national security state, where crimes and cover-ups are eroding our constitutional democracy and are being hidden behind the false veil of national security.
At the outset, I'd like to share with you a quotation that I found from Newsweek magazine of July 17th of 1989. It's talking about the upcoming criminal trials of Richard Secord and Admiral Poindexter and the others. And it says, and I quote, it says, "As with Oliver North's case, the central charges of these cases have been dropped to avoid disclosing embarrassing secrets. There is therefore not much hope that much will be learned about the most sinister aspect of this entire scandal, the off-the-shelf, standalone intelligence network. The Congressional Iran-Contra Committee concluded that this network was only in its formative stages when it was exposed, and that it collapsed after that. However," it says, "Newsweek has recently learned," this is in July of 1989, approximately 3 years after the filing of the Christic Institute lawsuit, said, "Newsweek has recently learned that this shadowy coalition of former CIA operatives and arms dealers was much more extensive and much more long-lived than has been admitted, and that this network still continues to perform specific chores for the Central Intelligence Agency in exchange for government favors." Then it quotes Robert Kastenmeier of the United States House of Representatives Intelligence Committee, charged with oversight of the intelligence committees, and he says, quote, "I don't think that we've ever had the single-mindedness to really get to the bottom of this thing. Therefore," he says, "that it appears that we will have to relive the mistakes that we have already made." Now, one of the major mistakes that we are going to be reliving, due to the refusal of the congressional committees to really have the single-mindedness of purpose to get to the real bottom of this thing, is the president's so-called war on drugs. And I want to talk with you briefly about this evening, and I want to just refresh our common recollection this evening at the outset of exactly what it is that President Bush in his September 5th, 1989 speech has recommended. He has pointed out that the gravest threat facing our nation today is drugs. That drugs have strained our faith in our system of justice. And he says, who is responsible for this? Let me tell you straight out, he said, everyone who uses drugs and everyone who looks the other way. Now this is the so-called casual user I think he's talking about here in many instances. So he says, what then is our plan? First, we are determined to enforce the law, he professes, and this means we have to have tougher penalties, he says. I am proposing that we enlarge our criminal justice system across the board. We need more prisons, more jails, more courts, more prosecutors. So tonight, I'm requesting an increase in the drug-related federal spending on law enforcement. That's his first proposal. Secondly, he said, the other element of our strategy is to look beyond the borders to where the crack and the cocaine are produced. To Colombia, for example, he said, where a $65 million emergency assistance program has been authorized. He said to assist the Andean nations in the military's fight against the cocaine cartels. This, he said, is just the beginning of a $250 million program to be imposed next year to assist the military in those countries. And this is just the beginning, the first part of a 5-year, $2 billion program to provide assistance to the military in these Andean nations. And then, thirdly, he proposes an amount of $321 million in total federal spending for treatment of those who have become addicted to the illegal drugs. Now, you recall these were the three basic aspects of his program, which I would like to explain to you this evening constitute one more fundamental mistake in our country based upon the refusal to get to the real bottom of the conduct of this off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing covert operation enterprise. And people will ask, well, who is the Christic Institute to speak to this particular problem. Why is it that the Christic Institute has any particular special expertise to authorize us to talk about this particular problem? Well, in a certain sense, we're just citizens such as you are. We're mothers and fathers, and I'm the father and Sarah's the mother of our 10-year-old boy, Danny Paul, and little Dagan, our 7-year-old boy. But when a couple months ago, little Dagan came into the house in Washington, D.C., where we live, and he said, "Mommy, Daddy, there's a rustler out in our front yard." We were going, "Yeah, right, a rustler in our front yard." Well, it turns out that what he meant was a hustler. And this hustler was a 12-year-old boy who had a wad of $20 bills, constituting about $500, that he was waving around to the other kids on the block, that he'd been able to earn by standing guard on his bicycle down on the corner to protect these men 4 blocks away from any police surveillance while they were selling crack cocaine to the kids in the neighborhood. And when Danny Paul, a week later, came into the house asking Sara what these things were that he found over on the playground, which were syringes over on the high school playground at the bottom of 12th Street, the house by where we live. Now, so in that sense, we're a lot like you are, like the mothers and fathers of our country who this September lived in fear with our kids going back to school, the fear of the access to the drugs in the school, and not just in the high schools, but in the little junior high schools, where in order to try to appear to be young teenagers, to act like some of the teenagers, that these young children are now getting into trying to sample some of these drugs. But on the other hand, we have a kind of a special history that has been touched upon by Bobby at the beginning, that from the very beginning of my legal practice, which is now 20 years ago, it seems like forever, 20 years, but the very first position that I held after coming out of Harvard Law School was at the Wall Street law firm of Cahill Gordon. I had the privilege there of being one of the 5 lawyers that represented the New York Times in attempting to get published the content of 47 volumes of classified documents, attempting at that time to tell the American people that there was a willful strategy of deception being foisted upon the American people by the executive branch of our government that was trying to tell us that there had been an aggressive war mounted against U.S. military personnel in ships in the Bay of Tonkin. And as it turns out, in the documents, it shows you that there never was any such attack, that this was a fabrication of the executive branch to attempt to deceive the American people, to make us think that we had been attacked, and that this policy was wrong-headed, it was bad for America. And I spent the very earliest years of my legal career attempting to explain to the American people that we were being actively and willfully deceived. Not just simply an error in judgment, not just simply a good faith mistake, but an active, willful, and malicious deception upon the American people. Later, in 1972, I went to the office of F. Lee Bailey, and at the time I was there, one of the partners, Jerry Alch, was representing James McCord of the Watergate burglars. And at that time, the office was attempting to explain to the American people that once again, there was an active and willful deception being perpetrated. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't that the president was reckless and made a mistake and didn't know what he was doing. He was willfully lying to the people of the United States that he had instigated a program of massive surveillance and infiltration of American citizens groups who were attempting to raise up the questions of public policy, to exercise our First Amendment liberties, and he had brought in a group of surveillance experts into his office to wage a clandestine war against the American citizenry, and that he knew exactly what he was doing, and he was lying to the American people. And I spent my time at the office where they were trying to share this information with the American people. Subsequent to that time, I went to work for the Jesuit National Office in Washington, D.C. There I had the privilege of becoming chief counsel for the Karen Silkwood case that many of you now know about. And at that time, once again, we were attempting to explain to the American people that there was a willful fraud being perpetrated upon the American people, that the executive branch in their Nuclear Regulatory Commission was consciously and willfully lying to the American people, that they knew full well that there was massive contamination going on of the workers at the facilities, that the people who lived in the vicinities of those facilities were being subjected to contamination, and that it was well known to the administration that that was happening. And yet they lied, and they said that they had run tests and they knew that there was not any safety problem around those facilities. And now, under the Bush administration, we hear them demanding that we as the American taxpayers pay $300 billion to clean up all of this mysterious contamination around these facilities, which they never really knew was happening. And finally, when we set up the Christic Institute, we were involved, for example, in the Greensboro civil rights case, where the government attempted to convince the American people that there was simply a right-wing group of American Nazi Party people and Ku Klux Klan people who had engaged in a sort of fair and equal shootout with some radical young organizers of unions down in Greensboro. The Christic Institute took that case, investigated it, and began to try to tell the American people that, in fact, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division of the Treasury Department, the FBI, and undercover agents from the Greensboro Police Department sat in the meetings, planned the attack upon those demonstrators, and concealed the actual events. And it wasn't believed until such time as we won a major federal lawsuit against those parties and demonstrated to the American people that it was true. And most recently, you know that the Christic Institute in May of 1986 filed a major federal racketeering lawsuit against some 24 men trying to tell the American people that there existed this off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing covert operation enterprise that was smuggling thousands of tons of military equipment down to the Contras from U.S. territory. We told the American people who the leadership was, of Richard Secord and Albert Hakim, his business partner, and Tom Kleins, and Jack Singlaub, and the rest of the people. No one wanted to believe it at the time. The New York Times refused to publish any of the information. The Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the major networks refused to publish this. And it wasn't until months later, when Eugene Hassenfuss was shot down in October of 1986, some 6 months later, and confessed in a public press conference in Nicaragua, naming the location out of the safe house from which they had flown the weapons, that UPI went to the safe house and obtained copies of the telephone records, and there were the names of 11 of our defendants. And only then did the major media begin to discuss this at all, trying to treat these people as a group of bad apples, a group of renegade private individuals who had gathered together in their retirement to try to wage this foolish war against Nicaragua. And then we attempted to tell the American people that, in fact, a young lieutenant colonel by the name of Oliver North and his assistant Rob Owen, who was in fact the chief legislative aide for Dan Quayle, prior to coming to the post with Oliver North, were involved in helping coordinate this activity, and no one wanted to hear it. No one wanted to talk about it. And it wasn't until they were caught later in November shipping tow missiles to Iran and transferring some of the profits from that sale into the same accounts that they were using to buy weapons for the Contras that anyone chose to believe that. And of course now, as things have developed, people realize what the involvement was of Oliver North and his superiors. But then we attempted to try to tell the American people that George Bush himself and Ronald Reagan himself and George Bush's national security advisor, Donald Gregg, had intimate knowledge of the entire program, that in fact they were coordinating and having direct face-to-face meetings with those running the operation, George Bush said on the front page of the New York Times, if this upstart Christic Institute thinks that they have anything on us, let them put up or shut up. At which point we subpoenaed his secretary and ordered her in and subpoenaed the documents showing that George Bush had face-to-face meetings with Oliver North and Felix Rodriguez, the man who was running the Ilopango airlift to the Contras, all during the Boland Amendment period. And we had 2 official White House memoranda stating that the subject matter of those face-to-face meetings was the military resupply of the Contras. At which point, Donald Gregg said that that must be a typographical error. Despite the fact that we had the sworn testimony of his own secretary saying that that was in fact the subject matter of the discussions. It was the discussion of the Contras. Now, however, no one wanted to publish that and no one wanted to deal with that. They said that it seemed to be politically motivated because there was a campaign coming on and the Republican Party had nominated George Bush for president. And therefore, the Christic Institute must be attempting to keep George Bush from being elected president. We thought that was a public service. And then, when Oliver North was criminally prosecuted, even though they withdrew the major counts against him because the White House refused to turn over the documentation proving his guilt of major criminal conspiracy and embezzlement of money, the government released a 42-page statement of admissions, which expressly acknowledged that the Vice President of the United States was meeting with the President of Honduras and entered into an agreement whereby the President of Honduras released military equipment to the Contras in direct exchange, a quid pro quo, for a special promise from the American government that they would increase the military and economic assistance to Honduras. And in this 42-page admission, an official document filed in the court, it acknowledged that President Reagan was fully knowledgeable of the program and that he, in fact, had placed direct telephone calls to the President of Honduras to get him to release military equipment to the Contras. But only then would it be reported to the American people, after it was too late, after George Bush had been made president, after he had nominated Donald Gregg to be the ambassador to South Korea. And when we turned over this evidence to Senator Cranston, who in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee challenged the authority of Donald Gregg to be an ambassador representing the United States, the vote was taken and every single one of the Republican senators voted to confirm Donald Gregg. And 3 Democratic senators agreed to ratify him. It's very interesting. One of them was Chuck Robb, the Democratic senator from Virginia, whom you might like to know intends to be president of the United States someday, and believed that by doing this favor for the Republicans, he could demonstrate his ability to get along with both Republicans and Democrats. And he stated for the media that President Bush had assured him that there would be no demonstrable evidence that could be provided to show that in fact Donald Gregg was directly involved in supplying equipment to the Contras. And a second Democratic senator, Claiborne Pell, said a very interesting thing. He said, well, he thought that Donald Gregg, during his testimony, had been as honest as he could be under the circumstances. And the third senator, Terry Sanford from North Carolina, had an extremely interesting point of view. He said that, well, it may well be true that Donald Gregg was lying, but he was lying to protect the president, not to protect himself, and that's different. And so what we see the mistakes that have been pointed out by Newsweek in July being repeated over and over again, and now we see a bizarre program proposed by the president to address the drug crisis. The Christic Institute has come to Los Angeles tonight, once again, to inform you that this is a willful and knowing lie. It is a willful and knowing lie. Just as when President Bush said that he knew nothing of the weapons going to the Contras, exactly like Bush when he said he knew nothing about the weapons going to Iran. And he is fully cognizant of what his policy is going to do. And what I would like to point out to you is, first, what it is that the Christic Institute has said in our complaint about the drug smuggling, so that you can understand what the position was that was set forth publicly back in May of 1986, directly in unison with each of these other major revelations that the Christic Institute had brought to the American people, so that you can judge independently the veracity of these charges. Well, we have pointed out that the self-financing aspect of this off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing covert operation enterprise bragged about to Congress by Oliver North. The self-financing aspect of this has in part to do with a massive cocaine smuggling program that has been undertaken between 1979 and 1986 into our country. We pointed out that the source of the cocaine were people by the name of Jorge Ochoa and Pablo Escobar, names that were not very well known to very many people in the country at the time we charged them with being the source of supply of the cocaine from a group which we revealed of the Medellin cartel down in Colombia. We pointed out that the transport of this cocaine was being provided by smuggling the cocaine from Colombia into Costa Rica, that it was being landed on a major ranch owned by an expatriate American by the name of John Hull. From there, the cocaine was being transported by a company by the name of Frigorifico Puntarenas, owned by Dagoberto Nunez. It was being brought into the United States through a group called the Ocean Hunter Seafoods Company, owned by Francisco Paco Chanes in Miami. That the cocaine was being distributed from Miami, and that portions of the profits being paid to them for the transport were being used to purchase weapons for the Contras. That the people purchasing the weapons were a man by the name of Ronald Joseph Martin, who owned the Tammy Amy gun shops in Miami, and he had a partner by the name of Mario Delamico, functioning in Honduras, operating a major drugs for guns supermarket. We pointed out that airplanes were flying directly from John Hull's ranch in Costa Rica into Memphis, Tennessee, landing at a place called Hagler Air Services Corporation, owned and operated by a man by the name of Marion Hagler. Now, people challenged us on this and said that you have to reveal to us your sources. We said we thought the FBI had a capacity to undertake its own investigation, and that the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division could undertake its own investigation, and that the Drug Enforcement Agency could undertake its own investigation. And we pointed out that the sources that we had were entirely credible, that they would be revealed at the proper time of trial, and that these people were telling information that could be verified independently by investigations. We communicated this to the New York Times and to the various other newspapers and media. We are now able to communicate to the American people who the sources were. We were attacked and said these are probably some kind of peon, low-level street pushers that are telling you these rumors. Turns out that the sources of the information were Ramon Milian Rodriguez, no one other than the chief bookkeeper for the Medellin cartel, Luis Blandón, the chief of intelligence for Manuel Noriega of Panama, and George Morales, the chief pilot for the cartel, and pilots such as Michael Tolliver, Gary Betzner, Geraldo Duran, and others, as well as Jack Terrell, a man from the Civilian Military Assistance Group working with Tom Posey and others. Now, at the time we were preparing to present this evidence to a federal court in Miami, just on the eve of presenting the evidence, you may remember that Gerhard Gazelle, the judge who was prosecuting Oliver North, who was sitting over the prosecution of Oliver North in Washington, said that he didn't think it was a good idea for these trials to be going on directly in the midst of this political campaign. When he was told by the defendants that a civil case was going to be commencing, he stated from the bench that he intended to get a hold of Judge King in Miami, our judge, and to see to it that the criminal case went forward first, but not until after the elections. Judge King on the eve of our trial, stopped our trial from going forward, prohibiting the evidence from being given to a jury, and stopped our trial. When we sought appeal from his ruling, he immediately imposed upon us a $1.3 million cash bond requirement, saying that we had 10 days in order to post with the court $1.3 million in cash as a condition for our being able to pursue the appeal. He also told us that he was going to require us, unless we prevailed on appeal, to pay all of the attorney's fees and all of the out-of-pocket costs for all of these defendants, because the charges that we had made against them were not true. Now, since that time, we contacted the some 80,000 people that are on the Christic Institute mailing list, received contributions from you and others across the country like yourselves, and were able to post the $1.3 million bond and have pursued the appeal into the Court of Appeals. And during the interim, during which we have been filing the papers in the court on appeal, John Hull has now been criminally indicted for massive cocaine smuggling in Costa Rica. As you know, Oliver North has been criminally indicted, Richard Secord has been criminally indicted, Albert Hakim has been criminally indicted, Jose Fernandez has been criminally indicted. All of these men that Judge King said we were falsely accusing have been criminally indicted now, and it has been discovered by the Costa Rican government that the OIJ official who was in charge of the La Penca bombing investigation, which is the bombing in which our plaintiff, Tony Avergon, was injured in a terrorist assault using equipment and weapons provided by these people, that they discovered that the chief investigator for the OIJ in Costa Rica, who closed down that investigation, was an informant and on the payroll of the Central Intelligence Agency. He has been dismissed, and I can announce to you tonight that the Costa Rican government has now officially reopened the La Penca bombing investigation. Moreover, for all of these defendants who are complaining about us falsely and frivolously charging them with involvement in a drug smuggling cartel, the Costa Rican Legislative Assembly has set up an official drug commission investigation, and they have issued their report condemning John Hull as a massive cocaine smuggler. They have declared him to be a persona non grata, not allowed to return to Costa Rica, and they have additionally named as persona non grata prohibited return to Costa Rica because of their involvement and responsibility for the drug smuggling cartel the following men: Richard Secord, Jose Fernandez, Louis Tams, the United States ambassador to Costa Rica, Oliver North, and we have now been notified by the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals that the final briefs will be accepted in October, and they are going to schedule for oral argument our appeal. And we are going to be doing the oral argument at the beginning of the year, and we are going to be reversing these charges of Judge King, saying that we had no evidence against these men for involvement with cocaine smuggling in the Contra network. And what I want to point out is that during this same interim, a major study has been undertaken by the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a bipartisan study chaired by United States Senator from Massachusetts John Kerry, and also participated in by the Republicans, led by Alphonse D'Amato, an extremely conservative Republican senator from New York. And I want to read for you, in the face of Judge King's assertions that he didn't believe that there was any evidence showing that the Contra people were involved in drug smuggling and other activities, I want to read for you the findings, briefly, of the Senate of the United States. It said that the United States government has refused to acknowledge the threat to our national security posed by the drug cartel. Foreign policy considerations have interfered with the U.S. ability to fight the war on drugs. Foreign policy priorities toward the nations of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Panama have halted or seriously interfered with U.S. law enforcement efforts to keep cocaine from flowing to our country. Within the United States, these drug traffickers of the Medellin cartel have manipulated the U.S. justice system by providing certain services in support of U.S. foreign policy objectives. U.S. officials involved in Central America failed to address the drug issue for fear of jeopardizing their war against Nicaragua. This war against Nicaragua has thus weakened an already entirely inadequate law enforcement capability. And there is now substantial evidence demonstrating that drug smuggling has been undertaken on the part of the Contras, the Contra suppliers, Contra pilots, mercenaries who worked with the Contras, and Contra supporters throughout the region. It goes on to point out that throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Manuel Noriega manipulated U.S. foreign policy toward his country and accumulated near absolute power in Panama. And it points out that it is now clear that each and every U.S. government agency which had any relationship with Manuel Noriega willfully turned a blind eye to his drug smuggling as he was becoming a key player on behalf of the Medellin cartel. Now, you'll recall the president's statement stating who we should blame for the drug epidemic. Everyone who looks the other way are responsible, as he told us. It states that the narcotics law enforcement has taken a back seat to these national security priorities, and thus the war on drugs has been sacrificed to these other foreign policy considerations. Now, you should contact Alan Cranston's office or Pete Wilson's office or your congressperson's office to ask them to send to you a copy of this United States Senate report on narcotics and foreign policy. And I would point out to you what it's going to tell you, as it says here, it says that specifically it says that we really are not faced with a law enforcement problem here in the United States. We are faced, more importantly, with a national security problem that has been generated by our foreign policy and by the conduct of the intelligence communities and the covert operations activities of this off-the-shelf standalone enterprise that has established this alliance with the cartel. Who else does the United States Senate inform the American people are responsible for this? They point out that the military in Honduras is directly involved in drug-related corruption, undermining all attempts to establish any truly democratic, civilian-based government. Because of the pervasive influence of the Honduran military in that country, there is now reason for concern that the experience in Panama may well be repeated in Honduras. And it points out that the operation of the drug cartels pose the most serious threat to the consolidation of democracy throughout Latin America. The basic foundation upon which democracy rests is respect for law and order and the guarantee of individual rights and liberties. The cartels respect neither law nor the rights of individuals nor the institutions created to protect both. Now, these are the findings of the United States Senate. They were published in April of this year, months before the president came forward and told us that the real solution to this problem was concentrating on the street-level pushers to shut them down. And we should ignore these major producers in Colombia and in the Andes. All we should do is send $260 million to the military, eventually $2 billion to the military of those countries. The Senate stated to them on page 137 of their report, the current strategy is utterly failing to stem the flow of narcotics because law enforcement authorities are focused on the very least vulnerable level of the cartel's operations, the pushers and the distributors. When drug salesmen and distributors are arrested, they are immediately replaced without any serious disruption whatsoever to the operations of the cartel. Now, therefore, you have to ask yourself a certain question. Did the president not know about this? Was the president out of this loop too? Does he not know that the United States Senate has conducted massive investigations and has specifically told him that anyone who focuses a policy on the drug pushers and salesmen is doing nothing whatsoever to significantly impact the flow of cocaine into this country? I dare say that he did know about that. And then he proposes sending first $65 million to the military in Colombia, in Bolivia, and Peru, to be followed by $2 billion of money to the military. So we ask ourselves, is this going to do any good? Did he know whether it would do any good? I would ask you to remember that it was on September 5th of this year that he issued his speech. Here is an article from the New York Times of Thursday, August 31st, approximately 6 days before the president issued his speech, offering $2 billion of military aid to the military in those countries. In Colombia, the military is part of the problem, it states. And it points out that if the United States and Colombia are to be effective in their fight against the cartels, the drug cartels, they must face one cardinal fact. The cartel could not impose its reign of terror on Colombia without the direct cooperation of high-level military authorities in that country. For years, the drug dealers have been the dominant participants in political violence in that country. The gunning down of Senator Luis Carlos Guillen, the front-running candidate in Colombia's forthcoming presidential election, is only the most recent and the most famous of the murders of the drug cartel. The violence that led to the Guillen murder included many killings of the leaders of the progressive groups in that country, such as the members of Union Patriarca, it says, who have lost more than 1,000 members to the violence of the drug cartel since 1985. The drug dealers are determined to wipe out the progressive forces to ensure perpetuation of the regressive social order. They hope to become part of the oligarchy which rules Colombia. They have therefore forged a direct alliance with the armed forces. Their targets have come to include the leadership of the traditional parties, members of the press, and anyone intent upon making Colombia a real democracy. The Medellin drug cartel recruits and trains and finances paramilitary assassination groups. These groups are responsible for the vast majority of Colombia's murders of trade union and peasant union leaders, social activists, and progressive political figures. It points out that the military commanders have disrupted and interfered with all efforts to carry out any investigations of this massive homicide wave against the progressive political officials in Colombia. And it points out that except for a couple of cases in which officers were transferred or forced to retire, their connection between the paramilitary cartel assassins and the leaders of the army are treated as mere aberrations, not as a symptom of a serious disease. And it points out that unless we focus upon this link between the military and the drug cartel, it's that a link that originates in a shared ideology of virulent anti-communism, military aid sent by the United States to these countries will be wasted on this unholy alliance. If the war is to be won, we need to know who the enemy really is. And it said the United States could well be arming the very enemy that it tells the American people it hopes to defeat. So you wonder, maybe the president doesn't read the New York Times either. And he's unaware of the fact that the military are the ones who are protecting these people. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is that the flow of cocaine into the United States has been a self-conscious effort on the part of the allies of this off-the-shelf private enterprise, working with this administration to mount a major war against the progressive political forces in Central America and Latin America. and that because the American people now are up in arms about this influx of cocaine, which has broken out of the ghettos and into the white community, and into the middle class community, and into the junior high schools and high schools of the white community, that the president has set forth a program that is going to give the false appearance of dealing with this problem by focusing its attention on programs that are visible to the white middle class community, by suggesting that he's going to be focusing upon the casual drug user, that he's going to be threatening to take away the driver's licenses of anybody found with 1 cigarette of marijuana in their car, that he's going to be having random urine tests imposed by as many private employers as he can. The problem isn't that in reality, but that is the appearance of the problem. And so I would like to point out one more thing about this issue of appearances, that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee made an additional observation. They pointed out on page 20 of their report that in 1985, increased public attention to the role of the Bahamas as a base for cocaine smuggling caused that government to hire a U.S. public relations firm. The public relations firm, Black, Manafort and Stone, submitted a memorandum to the government of the Bahamas, and they suggested that they undertake a program to get the government of the United States to direct public attention upon the demand side for the drugs and to divert their attention away from the supply side. This public relations firm, Black, Manafort and Stone, assigned to the matter Matthew Friedman, a former senior State Department official in the Reagan administration who had handled narcotics issues. What they don't tell you is that the senior partner of Black, Manafort and Stone was Lee Atwater, who is now the chairman of the Republican National Committee. And the New York Times points out in their September 3rd issue that one of the major people that was consulted by George Bush in crafting his policy to be announced was Lee Atwater. And of course, Lee Atwater's firm, Black, Manafort and Stone, is also the public relations firm that put the people in to lobby HUD, so that HUD would send its money away from building housing for the poor to build housing for the more wealthy, and to give massive, funds to former members of the administration. This is Black, Manafort and Stone, and that is Lee Atwater. And so you begin to ask yourself, can the president be this incompetent? Can he be this irresponsibly stupid? I don't go out of my way to pay great respect for this man, but he is not a stupid man. He does read the New York Times. He does know of the Senate Foreign Relations study. He does know of the relationship between the military and the protectors of the regime of drug smugglers in that country. So what I'm saying to you tonight is that we are faced with a policy, the implications of which are very clear, that there is not the slightest intention on the part of this administration to take steps to significantly disrupt the flow of cocaine and crack into this country. Because those who are in charge of the flow are people who supply intelligence data to the off-the-shelf intelligence community. They supply funding for covert operations, which we as citizens of the United States prohibit being undertaken through our congressional representatives. And they, in fact, are directly involved in attempting to undertake a massive assassination program against the progressive political leadership throughout Central and South America. And just as was the case with the Reagan administration, the Bush administration places a priority on this type of elimination of progressive forces of change in Central America, way above any objectives of any drug war in our country. Now, this information has been given to the United States Congress, and they have reported upon it. The President has ignored it. And the American people now are faced with a problem. What do we do, since all of us who have children of school age live in constant fear still of our children being exposed to these drugs and these types of dangerous underworld characters. The Democratic Party, we say, ought to be the source of the solution. Why shouldn't the Democratic Party raise itself up, take this information, and challenge the Republican administration, demand the impeachment of these government officials, the prosecution of these men? The problem, you see, is that the Democratic Party leadership has entered into a basic agreement with the leadership of the Republican Party to drop these investigations, to no longer pursue these investigations, in exchange for a promise on the part of the Republican Party leadership to abandon its military option against Nicaragua. If they will abandon the funding of the Contras and requesting more funds for them and dissolve the Contras, the Democratic Party leadership will agree to stand down on its further investigations of George Bush. It will stand down on any further investigations of the involvement in the perjury committed by Ronald Reagan. And it will stand down from any further serious investigations of the activities of the off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing covert operation enterprise. And any of those members of the Democratic Party who do not refrain from pushing these investigations will meet the fate of Jim Wright and Tony Coelho and the others. And there is a list which the Republican Party leadership has of leaders of the Democratic Party who might refuse to abide by this agreement, and they have gathered intelligence data and information on them with which to threaten them and coerce them. The fact is that we're in possession of direct memoranda from the people that worked with Oliver North, Carl Spitz-Channel, bragging about how they got rid of that son of a bitch, Mike Barnes, from Maryland, who had the gall to chair subcommittee hearings in the House of Representatives, the House Subcommittee on Western Hemisphere Affairs, to actually discuss the conduct of this off-the-shelf operation. We are in possession of the memos from Spitz-Channel bragging about directing monies from the enterprise into the congressional district and state of Mike Barnes to defeat him for re-election. These are lessons that are not missed by the representatives in Congress. And what I'm telling you is that your local law enforcement are not capable of fighting this drug war as long as the source of supply continues at the massive level that it is being supported at. And I am telling you tonight, and make no mistake about the clarity of the point that is being made here, that the federal law enforcement officials will not protect you, absolutely will not protect you, because they have been fundamentally politically compromised by a conflict of interest at the highest levels of the executive branch of our government that has caused them to order good faith law enforcement officers on the federal level to stand down from these investigations. And this is not just the word of the Christic Institute you have to take. There is sworn testimony from assistant United States attorneys in Miami who worked under Leon Kellner, the U.S. attorney down there. When we were delivering witnesses and others were delivering witnesses to the U.S. Attorney's Office detailing these crimes, the assistant United States attorneys have testified now behind closed doors to the House Criminal Justice Subcommittee, the crime subcommittee, chaired by William Hughes of New Jersey, that they were specifically ordered by Leon Kellner to stand down on these investigations, and that he received telephone calls to that effect directly from Ed Meese in Washington, and from Stephen Trott in Washington, and from Lowell Jensen, deputies to Ed Meese, ordering them to halt those investigations. Now, what we're faced with now is an option. We cannot rely upon our local law enforcement because, given all of their good faith, they cannot cope with this problem. We cannot rely upon the federal law enforcement officials because they are engaged in bad faith, in an actual willful deception of the American people due to a conflict of interest. And so the time has come for self-defense. Not self-defense directed at some poor person standing on the street corner trying to sell drugs to try to finance their habit of addiction. not focusing upon some poor schnook who happens to run 2 or 3 people who are selling drugs in your community, but in fact to focus upon the source of supply, to move into action, to understand that this off-the-shelf, standalone, self-financing covert operation enterprise is the enemy of every mother and father in this country. And that while it has been recognized by the mothers and fathers of Central and South America that these men are their enemy because they have lost thousands of their family members, their sons, their fathers, their children, their mothers and wives, to the political assassination teams in Guatemala, El Salvador, and throughout the Latin American countries, this has not struck home to the American people. But now it is our children and our fathers and mothers and our brothers and sisters and our friends and neighbors who are victims of this off-the-shelf enterprise. It is your children who are in clear and present danger from the members of this enterprise. And so what I'm asking you to do is to direct your fury not at the local victims of this horrible epidemic, but to organize a political action group here in your city, a national political action group, to bring about the hearings that are necessary in Washington. We're asking you to get your city council, your county legislature, your state legislature to pass specific resolutions and send them to your congressional and Senate representatives. You have to ask, insist, demand that they convene a special investigative hearing by the Judiciary Committee in both the House and the Senate. In the House under the chairmanship of Jack Brooks of Texas, and in the Senate under the chairmanship of Joseph Biden, to have full-scale hearings into the real historical origins of the off-the-shelf standalone enterprise and into the relationship with the drug traffickers of the covert operational divisions of the intelligence community. And you have to ask them to look into the reasons for the failure of the U.S. Justice Department to thoroughly investigate and prosecute these men due to the conflict of interest of the Justice Department and the executive branch. All of that is the constitutional sworn duty of those men who represent you and sit on the Judiciary Committee in the Senate and the House. And if they fail to perform their constitutional duties, they are to be removed from office. Secondly, you have to ask them to personally introduce a bill into the United States Congress calling for the amendment of the National Security Act of 1947. You have to ask that they amend this statute to totally prohibit, by criminal penalty, any and all contact between agents or private representatives of the intelligence community of the United States with any growers, financiers, or traffickers in any illegal drug. You have to totally prohibit the use of any of those drug traffickers as a source of intelligence data, as a source of money, or as allies pursuing any given foreign policy objective of our government. And you have to, as I said, make such contact a federal crime, punishable against any member of the intelligence community or any private person acting at their behest, imprisonable in federal prison. And you have to, fourthly, ask that that act establish a permanent office of independent counsel to investigate, prosecute, and convict those guilty of such contacts. You cannot rely upon the federal Justice Department, and you cannot rely upon an individual independent counsel assigned and set up by a charter drafted by the Attorney General, such as Ed Meese, because the charters are too narrow and they will not do the job. The Christic Institute will do our job. We will bring this case to trial. You have our word on that. We have encountered this type of resistance in the Karen Silkwood case and in other cases, and we will not be stopped, that we will do our part to present the direct evidence to an independent jury of American citizens proving to the American people that these facts are true. But you have to do your job. The time has come for you to stop being intimidated, to stop being peripheralized, to make you think that somehow the only thing that you can do is to stand by and just supplicate these congressional representatives, to just wait for them to do something to protect your children in your neighborhoods. They will not do this. They will not do this unless you make them do this. The bottom line is that the ride is over. The American people can no longer stand passively by and allow these men to wage war upon our children. And the time has come for us to tell these men that we are mad as hell and that we are not going to stand for this anymore. It's time for us to stand up for our rights, to stand up for our children, and at base, it has come time for us, each and every one of us, to stand up for our country. Thank you very, very much.
This information raises basic ethical and political questions about the course and conduct of U.S. foreign policy and the role played by the off-the-shelf enterprise. It also raises questions about the accountability and integrity of our highest elected officials. I hope that you will join the Christic Institute in pursuing the answers to these critical questions. Over 70,000 individuals and 60 organizations, including many of the major religious denominations, support the Institute's efforts. Since we represent our clients without charging legal fees, the generous contributions of private individuals like you, as well as foundations, churches, and synagogues, sustain the Christic Institute. We need your support if we are to continue this important work. Until the connection between covert operations and drug trafficking is broken, crack will continue to flood our communities, and those who are truly responsible will continue to go unpunished. One way to break this deadly connection is to ensure that the Lepenka lawsuit has the financial resources to go to trial. Another is to educate your community about the crimes committed by the enterprise. I hope you will write a $20 check and become part of our ongoing educational and action network. If you can, make a larger contribution, and you will ensure that this important investigation continues to uncover the truth. Together, we must demand that our Congress prohibit all covert use of drug traffickers and condemn the cynical notion that anything goes in the name of national security. Together, we must insist on a new approach to national security, one that reflects our nation's democratic principles, respects international law, and protects our children against the devastation of drugs.